Poor Tenets Chapter 2. Colonel Benjamin McCullough had known that moving higher up the ranks in the army would award him several privileges befitting a decorated officer. He, however, failed to see the privilege in being sent to a small town in Montana to check up on his superior officers' mess-ups. But when a 4-star asks you to go in his stead, you have little option to say otherwise. He pulled his car into the driveway, admiring the porch of the home. Must have been recently repainted. He whistled lowly to himself, admiring the home for a moment before walking towards it. They had lovely taste.
I wonder if they used bear paint for that trim.
Adjusting his service cap, he walked up to the door, rapping twice on it before taking a step back. A young voice could be heard calling from inside the house.
Oh, I got it.
The door swung open and the colonel blinked dumbly down at the very short, brightly colored figure who stood in the doorframe. There was a squeak and a rush of air before the doorway was suddenly empty. Heavy footsteps approached quickly and an alarmed woman came to a stop, grabbing the doorframe and eyeing him in a way he'd almost describe as dangerous. He found himself minutely straightening his posture.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Who are you?
If a question could be an accusation, it sounded like that. She straightened as well, the momentum leaving her stance. Closing the door slightly, clearing her throat, she raised her chin, some of the steel in her eyes retreating. The colonel removed his service cap slowly. He had some experience with individuals mistrustful of the military, but this wasn't just fear. It was alarm and veiled hostility.
I'm Colonel Benjamin McCullough. Ma'am, I'm here on behalf of...
We already spoke to your people.
She interrupted him with a cold smile.
Yes, a general, I believe, and everything was just fine. They left us alone after disrupting and endangering the lives of civilians.
Ben winced internally at that. He'd been briefed rather quietly on the situation and it had not been good or pretty, and this family had somehow become involved and endangered. He'd heard about the existence of an alien creature, a young one that had proven more useful than threatening. If the colonel knew anything about the government, and as a career army officer he knew a lot, it was that they'd seek for the most beneficial relationship. But not if there was an imbalance of power or a lack of control.
Yes, well, myself and my partner were sent to touch base on whether or not you had any contact with the, individual who was involved in the incident 6 months ago. I know we already had contact with your family, but the government was hoping to reveal some new information.
There was the sound of footsteps approaching in the hallway and a man showed up behind her, taking up the rest of the space in the doorway in a similar manner as the woman had.
Sir.
He greeted. His demeanor wasn't as cold as his wife's, but Benjamin could tell there was little love lost. He resigned himself to an uncomfortable encounter.
You must be Sheriff Tom Wachowski. I'm Colonel Benjamin McCullough.
The general extended a hand that the sheriff shook firmly, very firmly.
I am.
Well, we won't have any new information for you, Colonel.
The woman cut in, her and her husband in perfect sync.
So I'm sorry if it'll be a long drive back, but you can be on your way.
Mrs. Wachowski gave him a bright, cold smile.
Well, actually, there's a procedure this time around. I understand it'll be tedious and thorough, but hopefully, once everything is concluded and approved, then we'll be on our way, and considering everything is in order, you won't have to interact with the government for this incident again.
Wait.
Mrs. Wachowski shot a glance behind him.
A procedure.
The sheriff frowned.
How long will that take exactly? Count on to someday. We had plans.
The colonel nodded, gesturing to a portfolio he held in his hand.
I actually have the initial interview papers right here, and I'll be able to give you a brief outline of my itinerary for the coming week. And the investigation will be conducted by myself and my partner, Brigadier General Thomas. He'll join me shortly.
He gestured vaguely towards the house.
May I come inside?
A week.
Mrs. Wachowski looked to her husband, concerned.
As I said before, Colonel Costa, the plan's on a Sunday, didn't even call to confirm. Shut up out of the book.
Somehow, Benjamin could tell that wasn't the entire truth.
I hope you understand how rude that was.
Mrs. Wachowski chimed in. Ben ducked his head sheepishly. He had disagreed with dropping in on the family unannounced.
I do apologize, ma'am. It was to keep the interview as honest as possible, but I understand how dismissive it was to your personal schedules, however. If later this afternoon would be more convenient, I'm willing to bend the rules a hair. My partner is scheduled to arrive in a half hour. I do have a question. However, what was that opened the door?
He leaned over to look into the hallway. Almost immediately the sheriff moved into his line of sight, a hard set to his jaw.
Must have been our dog.
It was blue.
He got into craft paint.
In any other situation, the colonel would have found the entire exchange incredibly amusing. Right now, he felt oddly tense, like he was crossing into dangerous territory.
Looks like there's something to find after all.
He thought as he chuckled, shooting to dissipate the tension.
Well, animals do have the funniest way sometimes, don't they? Then I'll return later today to complete the first round of interviews, unfortunately. I do have to insist that it be done today. I'll return at 4 o'clock. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
He nodded politely to them and pointedly avoided meeting their sharp stares as his car left their driveway.
They're clearly hiding something.
He thought gloomily, but he had very explicit orders, and he had to do his best to uphold them. Brigadier General Thomas was even more strict regarding them than he was. It seemed like this week would be like pulling teeth. Meanwhile, things at the Wachowski household were coming to a head. Tom and Maddie climbed the stairs to the attic to check in on a certain young hedgehog. Then Sonic was pacing a line through the middle of the room, buzzing with a bright, anxious light. When he spotted them, he rushed to them but stopped short of reaching them, as if afraid to close the distance.
I'm sorry, I'm so sorry.
He gasped.
I thought it was I didn't know. I didn't know.
Buddy Sonic, it's okay.
Tom kneeled down and reached out for the boy, worry crinkling his features.
It's okay, he barely saw you.
I run, didn't I? They're going to take me away, and I have to leave and never come back, and I put you in danger as well.
No one will take you away, honey.
Maddie said. Sonic's eyes snapped to her, and Tom had to admire Maddie's ability to capture and hold Sonic's attention.
If you truly think it'll be safest for you to leave, we'll cross that bridge when we get together.
Green eyes grew wide, losing the tinge of terror as the implication of her words sunk in.
But you have to trust me when I say that none of this is your fault and that everything will be okay.
But how can you be sure?
He pleaded.
I shouldn't have let my guard down.
Sonic so desperately wanted to believe Tom and Maddie, but Longclaw had been strong, and in the end he'd had no choice but to abandon her and run away. It was always running. He always had to leave. He could never have anyone.
Sonic!
Maddie took his face into her hands, ignoring the energy that lanced into her palms.
We're in this together. Trust your family to keep you safe, kiddo, because we will.
Tom gently coaxed the sparking hedgehog into his arms. The sparks tingled against his skin, but it was nowhere near painful. Sonic came slowly but willfully. Maddie reached out to gently rub his ears. He made a soft noise, digging his face into Tom's chest. Everything had been finally settling. This was all so much.
Trust us, buddy. We've got you and Maddie as a joke. Even the whole town, just a little trust, okay?
McKay.
He mumbled, suddenly too weary to even argue. Maddie rose from her kneeling position, nudging her husband gently.
Tom, why don't you and Sonic go downstairs and see if you can rustle up some lunch? I'm going to make a couple of calls.
Her husband glanced at her warily.
All right.
He said slowly.
Give way to call as well, please, and begin to fill in the rest of the office honorary officer visiting.
Maddie nodded, heading downstairs swiftly. Tom adjusted his hold on Sonic, setting him down so he could look at him.
What do I say then? Let's make some food.
Sonic nodded, uncharacteristically white. Green gaze centered on something behind him. Tom followed his gaze to the attic window at the far end of his room. An idea began to take shape in his mind.
Well then, since it's such a lovely day, let's make some lunch. Leave Manny for work and go for a walk.
He corrected, shooting the small figure a goofy smile.
I can imagine you'd like to get some real movement in right about now.
Tom noted with satisfaction that his hunch had proved correct as two blue ears perked up at the possibility of a run.
Can I? I mean, I know I can, but can I? Should I? Seems like a bad idea considering.
The stuffy colonel isn't going to go into woods. Besides, who knows these woods better than you go on to just to provide backup.
He said in his best official voice, that finally coaxed a grin out of the blue hedgehog.
Officer Donut Lord reporting for duty.
He crowed, jumping out of Tom's arms in a burst of joyful energy.
Hey, that's Sheriff.
Sonic only grinned and sped off, already yelling about run-friendly foods. Following him down, Tom quickly mimed what they were off to do to Maddie, who was enthusiastically engaged in a phone call. She nodded and waved them off with a smile, quick to return to her phone call. Changing into some workout clothes first, Tom met Sonic in the kitchen, who was already pulling out sandwich ingredients.
Someone's excited for a run.
He observed, pulling out the condiments and veggies. He didn't see Sonic's wince.
Oh, I probably should have waited before going around touching your food, right? It's not mine. That was probably really dumb of me.
Tom turned to see the blue hedgehog, who was close to beating a quick retreat. Despite the time he spent with them, the confidence he possessed and inspired, Tom sometimes forgot that Sonic had been alone for 10 years. He mentally berated himself before continuing, nonchalant and reassuring.
No, I'm in a rush too, and everything in the pantry is as much yours as it is ours. Only one rule.
He placed his fist on his hips in a fox serious pose.
Always clean up after yourself.
Sonic smiled back at him, weak but present.
Man, that's a terrible pose.
I'd like to see you better.
Immediately, Sonic hopped on the counter, planted his feet and puffed out his chest with both fists on his hips. Tom stifled a laugh but nodded.
I stand corrected.
Releasing his held breath, in a whoosh, Sonic punched the air with a victory yell.
Sonic 1, Donut Lord 0.
Our champion, help me set up these sandwiches so it can gargle on the mail and meat salad veggies.
A couple of slightly swooshed Emmys later, they were on their way with Ozzy and Tao. As soon as he reached the tree line, Tom noticed Sonic release a quick relieved sigh before zipping off, unperturbed. Tom followed the trail he knew by heart with Ozzy. All things considered, Sonic was taking this surprisingly well, and it was only a week, just a week to get through, and then they could turn their focus on more important things. The shade beneath the trees was cool and comforting, the only noise coming from songbirds and the rustle of shoes on dead leaves as they trekked down the worn path. Tom could only hope that the kid was finding his own sense of peace running through the woods. Maddie could remember the last time she'd taken the time to make this many calls. She and Tom weren't hermits by any means and had a good relationship with the rest of the town, but truth be told, she wasn't the kind of person to pick up the phone and call neighbors for gossip, until now. Calling it gossip was nearly demeaning. It all felt purposeful, strategic, almost. She stifled a giggle at the thought. Green Hills was many things, but strategic was not a characteristic anyone would assign anytime soon. Protective was more like it, reminiscent to the time Barbara's husband had died in a terrible accident 5 years ago. He'd worked at a big plant a half hour outside of town, and reporters from neighboring towns had flocked to the poor widow trying to see if she knew anything about her husband's involvement with the accident. Maddie remembered how desperate she'd been at the time. And without anyone really being told or deciding to, people just protected her. It sounded so grand, but it was more in the little actions, tickets and fines for the smallest technical issue in parking their vans, neighbors dominating reporters as they tried to slink closer to Barbara's house. Even Maddie had chipped in, walking Ozzy down her street and accidentally loosening her grip on his leash. The reporter had been run haggard before he'd finally climbed back into his van for safety. She'd come.
Oh wait, it's Maddie. Just calling a couple people real quick. I may be overreacting, but I'd much rather be safe than sorry.
Hey Maddie, is everything alright?
Despite it being a phone call, Maddie could feel Wade's mounting tension as she recounted their morning to him.
Now Wade, please don't panic. It's just a heads up.
She reassured.
Now I have to call Sonic School. Let them know he might not make it this week.
I'm really sorry, Maddie. I know he enjoys school.
A sudden rush of anger made her jaw clamp shut with a click. It wasn't fair. He did truly enjoy school, and after a rocky adjustment period he was finally becoming comfortable with being around children his own age. Maddie had suggested they start off with half-days and steadily build up from there. The kid was a whiz at picking up new things, but even he struggled with so many new materials, regimented school schedules, and extracurriculars. He'd worked so hard and it filled her with rage that it could be interrupted by something both so menial and threatening.
I appreciate it. Wait.
She sighed out, breathy and release.
I'll let you go now. Have a good one.
Once the call ended, she pressed the phone to her head, closing her eyes. Deep breath. Feeling less agitated, she turned back to the phone. It was uncharacteristic to feel so rattled, so unsettled by her own emotions, but Maddie was determined to keep it under control. This wasn't about her. She waved her boys away when they came down the steps with a smile as she made another call.
Miss Martha.
She sighed in relief at hearing the older woman's voice answer. Martha had worked in City Hall for as long as she and Tom had been alive. A severe, older woman. They'd only truly begun to appreciate her as they'd become adults. She had been instrumental in their adoption process as well, so the Wachowskis owed her big time.
I am so sorry to disturb you while you were at work, but I have a huge favor to ask of you about those papers. There's a small problem that just rolled into town.
The colonel turned onto the Tenny Hotel parking lot. He recognized the sleek silver car that belonged to his partner. These kinds of jobs really rubbed him the wrong way. There was nothing relaxing about this, despite the seemingly friendly setting of the small town. Best case scenario, people would be wary but cooperative. Worst case scenario, he might have to strong-arm his way to getting the information he needed. Colonel McCullough liked to think he wasn't a bad man, but operating under such stringent orders and in a town that had suffered some sort of mini disaster that had something to do with the government put him on edge. He was just stepping out of his car as his partner and superior approached the car.
Brigadier General Thomas.
He greeted with a crisp and brief salute.
Colonel McCullough, it's good to see you arrive safely.
You as well, sir.
Call me Connor. We'll be working together quite closely this week after all.
The colonel extended a hand to shake that the Connor took.
Benjamin, call me Ben.
Did you already swing by the sheriff's place?
You to business. Unsurprised, Ben nodded.
I did, not very welcoming. I pushed the interview back to 4 o'clock.
Connor shot him a disapproving glance that Ben returned coolly. It was the least he could do before inconveniencing the family a whole week. He'd stand by it if it was questioned, however. The general nodded after a beat.
Very well, let's settle on in the meantime.
I'll unload the equipment.
At that, the general's eyes sparked in interest.
Yes, surveillance, correct.
Yes, but only during specific hours and locations.
The instructions had been clear. Any tactics similar to Dr. Robotnik's bold and invasive stunts were rushed. This had to be by the book. The general hummed thoughtfully, but remained silent. Sonic risked a quick peek out his window as the sleek, gray car turned onto the driveway once more. He moved over to his bed, sitting on it as lightly as he could. After his brief run walk with Tom, he'd offered to leave the house for the remainder of the day, an offer he'd immediately regretted once he saw the uncomfort and sadness that crossed both Tom and Maddie's faces before they controlled their expression. Sometimes he'd say the wrong thing and they'd look so sad and weird about it. He tried to not say any more weird things. Tom had said it was okay. It was just a little different. But Sonic didn't like realizing how different his life had been before. He wasn't a normal kid, and that was okay, really. He was Sonic the Hedgehog. No one else had that clam. No one else could move at the speeds that he could or could boast that they took down a crazy, evil robot scientist. But Sonic hated the pity, wished it would go away. So here was, sitting in the attic that served as his room, trying to listen for the voices downstairs.
It's not all bad. Worst comes to worst, I can make it out.
He thought, eyeing the far window and skylight. Blue ears drooped suddenly as he remembered that they likely wouldn't be able to make it to Andy's barbecue this evening. He'd never really tried it. It wasn't something that Julie made it into trash bins, so he had to reason that it was yummy. How long was this going to take? Sonic eyed the digital clock next to his bed.
It hasn't even been 5 minutes.
Groaning internally, he got to his feet, tugging on his sneakers. There was no way he'd last up here the entire time.
Maybe just grab a snack, or go outside. If the agents are here, then I can go visit Andy.
After all, how hard could it be for the fastest thing alive to sneak past a couple humans holed up in the living room? The stairs would make too much noise, he reasoned, so window it was. In all honesty, he was kinda excited to sneak out the window. It all felt so adventurous, like the books Tom tried to distract him with, unaware that Sonic's rating and processing speed was meant to match his innate speed. Sonic stretched briefly and cracked open the window.
The drones are not meant to be used to spy on domiciles.
Colonel McCullough repeated, watching the general mess with the settings on a handheld device that commanded the sleek, tinny recording drone.
We'll merely be scouting out the territory. Won't be going too near the home. We're analyzing the area surrounding it for their safety, of course.
Of course.
He replied dry. The reasoning was touchy, but he knew it'd hold up under questioning. It was best to save any actual pushback for when he most needed it, and the way this week was starting, he'd need it more than he initially believed.
Right.
Connor clicked the handheld shut, pocketing it.
Let's go ahead and get this over with.
The two officers exited the car and walked up to the home. Behind them, the drone rose into the air on near silent blades. To be concluded eventually, since the next and final chapter is not published yet.